In October 2021, the American Psychological Association apologized for its role in maintaining racism in the United States. Was that too little too late? Does it signal a fundamental change in the way that we practice and think about psychology? Well, today we're here to talk about liberation psychology. The history of psychology is entangled with Western European thinkers of the 18 and 1900s who are not immune to their socio-cultural environments. And in the Americas, their ideas have been uncritically applied to people who are not middle-aged white men of European descent. The results of that have been less than stellar. That's the short version. We're going to define liberation psychologies as having three basic characteristics. First, they're interested in the universals of human experiences. That is, we were misguided from the 1850s until almost practically now in overprivileging the ideas of white, middle class European males. There are things about being human that are shared among all human beings, and psychology is at its best when it's looking for those universals of experience. Second, that we can try to understand the experiences of oppressed minorities. And third, that we are not neutral. When we discover injustices, it's the responsibility of the psychologist or the psychological scientist to attempt to redress those inequities or injustices. It was probably Martin Barrow who first suggested psychology needn't really strive for neutrality. Um, Lots of existentialists were and are people of faith. Certainly, my friends list is full of failed seminarians. Martin Barrow was not an existentialist, but I think we'd have gotten along. He was a Jesuit priest, and he was really interested in social action in South America. He thought that psychology could offer some insights into the conditions of oppressed people, how they got that way, and ways to make things better. His ideas spread through South America and Mexico really through the 1970s. In America, those ideas never gained any particular traction, certainly not among the treatment professions, uh, and not for want of oppressed minorities. Social psychology is probably the closest we come to examining the issues that surround oppressed people, but we do so still from a position of neutrality, where we do not use our social psychology skills and training to affect any meaningful change at a large scale. We're like wildlife documentarians, and we've discovered a fawn who is starving because her mother has been shot, and we just document the starvation of the fawn. In America, we'd have two main kinds of psychology that would share enough in common with the liberation psychology of South America that we could describe them in that way, even though the people practicing them might not always describe themselves as liberation psychologists. In 1968, black psychologists conducted a sit in at the annual American Psychological Association convention. They sat in all of the middle chairs and made noise while the association was attempting to convene a keynote speech. Unable to convene the keynote, the American Psychological Association leadership was really forced to deal with representatives from black psychology. The incoming and outgoing president and the presidents of some of the divisions had a closed door meeting with representatives from black psychology. They hashed some stuff out, and things began to change, at least a little bit. So this is the beginning, probably, of black liberation psychology in the United States. of black psychology as a truly organized movement getting something done. So it shares these characteristics with South American liberation psychology. It's interested in the universals, that is, applying the psychology of middle class white European men to black people in America. It just isn't a good fit. We wouldn't have the same concerns, wouldn't have the same history, the same ongoing social issues. So I work in China a fair amount, and sometimes my friends bring me stories. One story is a friend who had a psychiatric disturbance, started hearing voices, and had an irrational grief. He couldn't stop crying. Well, he was out in the provinces. City officials sort of swept in and gathered him up, took him to a psychiatric hospital where they attempted to use Freudian analysis to solve his problems. But this friend had no relationship with Freudian analysis. He didn't live in a country where Freud's ideas were widely talked about, or where psychotherapy was a thing people knew how to make use of, where analysis is on television all the time. He didn't make any progress, and so they started giving him medications. And as far as I know, he's still in that psychiatric hospital. It's just not a good fit. And so in China, we help people develop indigenous practices. That is a kind of psychology that works for them in their place. And this is what black psychology was arguing in 1968. Second, black liberation psychology examines what it means to be an oppressed minority in a racist country. Does your patient report anxiety? Well, what possible reasons might a black man be anxious in America in 1968? Any police interaction then and now could spell trouble no matter one's guilt or innocence. And the police created then and create now a lot of unnecessary interactions. Racial profiling was the order of the day, and it would remain the order of the day if it wasn't for a lot of cell phone footage making things public that previously were secret, at least from the white majority. Depressed? Well, depression is linked heavily to poverty. And America has worked and works hard to keep black people poor, while every day showing them evidence of white success. What to the slave is the 4th of July, asks W.E.B. Du Bois. Might as well ask, what is the American dream to the black person in America? Isolated? Paranoid? Where's your representation in media, and who controls that representation? Who's held accountable for crimes against people who look like you, perpetrated by people who look like me? This week, we got a verdict in the trial of Armand Arbery's killers. We had video of those 3 men murdering that young man just out for a jog. We had the 911 call, right, where one of the brothers says, the dispatcher says, "What's the nature of the emergency?" And he says, "There's a black man running down the road." That's the emergency. There's a black man running. They shot him to death. All of the evidence of the crime, and we were all holding our breaths, wondering if a jury could bring themselves to convict 3 white men of murdering a black man. Just this same week, we had the young man who showed up at the Black Lives Matter protest, right? Kyle Rittenhouse brings a long rifle to the party, ends up shooting several people, killing two people, and walks away. This is America. Not coincidentally, it's the America where the Democrat can be ahead 7 million votes at midnight, and we all go to bed wondering if the Democrat will be the president in the morning. Those are not coincidences. So, I mean, for people of color in this country, for black people in this country, feeling paranoid and isolated, anxious, or depressed might not be illnesses. They might not be illnesses. As Frankel and R.D. Laing have variously said, an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal. So a course of treatment might begin with finding the problem and setting some goals, but we might not get a ton of history. We might not want to talk too much about the person's childhood and their relationships with their mom. There's no need probably to analyze one's personal past. We'd rather dive into the socio-cultural issues of the day and start empowering that person to act. It's okay. It's okay to be angry or sad, depressed, or even despairing. And that paranoia might be functional. We might align with the symptoms because these are not symptoms of illness in the person, but symptoms of illness in their society. To cite Jiddu Krishnamurti, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. The person might learn some history and might learn to take pride in their identity. That identity could end up being multivarious, but it might center on African roots or American historical groups. A history of resistance, resilience, and action. Certainly in the 60s and the 70s, Afro power movements were rising in America, reconnecting previously disconnected Black people with their African cultural heritages, finding pride in those. Action is empowering. It drags one's locus of control back in from the environment. You can't control everything, but you have some measure of power and influence over what happens to you. So look up some people: Francis Sumner, Bev Tatum, Joe White, Herman Kennedy, Kenneth and Mamie Clark you've probably heard of. If the names don't tickle a bell in your head somewhere, just Google search the black baby doll test and spend some time with that. So Kenneth and Mamie were really more social workers than psychological workers, and they agitated. They agitated for changes. They exposed systemic problems and worked to fix those systemic problems. On to feminist psychology. The problem often is not the patient. So back to this. Maybe your new female client is depressed and anxious. And what could women in America have to be depressed or anxious about now, and especially in 1968? Well, life as a woman is dangerous and depressing. Women typically have smaller stature, appear more often as victims in the crime stats, experience pay disparities, work disparities, impossible beauty standards, and more communal and less agentic social roles. That is, men in American society, broadly speaking, are trained to be problem solvers. If we're hurt, we're told to rub some dirt on it, take a lap, and go back at it. Men are trained to be breadwinners, never take a day off work for any reason, show up hurt, depressed, sad, And women aren't. Women are trained to depend on other people, at least to be more interdependent with other people. Women are taught to go to the doctor when they're sick, to lean on somebody. So, if you want a better picture, bring a better face. This is how it is, not how it should be, and your mileage may vary with all of those things. But the older you are, the truer this is. We are getting some change in the younger generations. But what all that means is when men have a problem, they focus on solutions and they keep their locus of control close. When women have a problem, they have so much evidence that being a woman makes it harder to solve some kinds of problems in America. Women often have to bury their own needs in service of other people's needs. Women do most of the relationship maintenance in hetero relationships, which means subsuming a lot of needs to the needs of a man who might be less competent because he's necessary for safety and economic security. Okay. So that agentic role, that problem solving role, that is empowerment, and women in this country often lack that kind of empowerment. And then there's the Margaret Atwood problem. The quote is, when a man goes on a blind date, he's worried his date might be fat. But when a woman goes on a blind date, she's worried her date might murder her. So there's the Atwood problem. So sometimes the answer to women's problems isn't resilience or distress tolerance or mommy's little helper, right? Valium in the 1980s. Sometimes the answer to women's problems is to burn down the fucking patriarchy. Um, so we have these three things in common again. We're after universal principles. Not what is it like to be a man, what is it like to be a person? And then the focus on the individual problems of women as an oppressed minority, and then activism to solve those problems. Gay psychology, it could be argued, as a kind of liberation psychology. I think at its best, gay psychology is a liberation psychology. So, gay psychology had their own sit in. I don't know the year. I've tried to know the year. I haven't been successful in tracking it down. It must have been 72 or 73 because that's when the major changes really got started, like um, moving homosexuality out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness. Okay. So the whole GLBTQ spectrum constitutes a set of oppressed minorities, and in fact is sometimes referred to as sexual minorities. People are political footballs and scapegoats. In North Carolina, they try to worry frightened conservatives that trans people are really just pervy men trying to get in the bathrooms with their daughters. That's a political football. That's a scapegoat. Folks have probably internalized a lot of homophobia, a lot of transphobia. When they show up to therapy, they're sitting in a room with someone they do not know, maybe someone who looks like me, and they have no idea whether I might also be a homophobe or a transphobe. Having something on your sleeve. If I have a little white triangle, I have a little pink triangle in my doorway. Um, for what it's worth, because people can say they're a safe space and yet have no knowledge or real intent beyond virtue signaling and still be unsafe. They might not know anything. So at its best, gay psychology is probably when you show up to see your psychologist or your therapist and they also are on the sexual minority spectrum. They've been navigating society for a while, and they can help one sort out what is theirs and what belongs to society. So, no really healthy identity begins with internalized social standards, especially if one is an oppressed minority. So, working those out would for sure be part of a liberation psychology. So, where did all this stuff go? Are there still feminist psychologists sitting in rooms with women, explaining to them that their problems don't originate with them, they originate with their place in society? Are there still psychologists sitting in rooms with people of color, explaining that a cure for their depression, the helplessness and hopelessness of depression, might just possibly be activism if you're up for it and it's relatively safe for you to do that, or you're willing to take the risk? Well, no. Certainly not very much, not enough to rise to modern attention. The best version of this story is that those practices were absorbed into mainstream society, like the Borg, so that every psychologist now is at least at a baseline of cultural competence by the time that they license, so that we're not carrying forward the harms of the past and we do understand more of the universals rather than the specifics of experience. I'm not sure that's a realistic story. In the communities that I wander through, definitely there's a big focus on the cultural competence and on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are we smashing it? Are we doing the best possible job? No, certainly not. And bear in mind that modern psychiatry and psychopharmacology are sort of back to rob us of our biological and cultural distinctiveness by presupposing that all difficult feelings are symptoms of illness that can and should be treated with medicine. I've been mulling over the question: is existential psychology a liberation psychology? I heard the phrase muttered at an existentialist convention in San Francisco probably 12 or 13 years ago. I don't remember who said it. I don't remember anything about the context. It's just been rolling around in my subconscious. Existential psychology is a liberation psychology, someone says very forcefully. But on what basis? On what basis? Is it true? So, here we are. We're often aligned. We're often aligned with the interests of liberation psychologies. We're aligned with women and people of color and their interests. Our cultural competence demands that we understand the struggles even when we don't look like the people who are struggling. Like the rest of psychology, we still have our work to do. Existentialism tends to focus on the individual, on individual responsibility as one of the 4 or 5 givens of psychology. We actively avoid grouping, preferring to let the client choose their own labels. If we have to talk about race, how would you like for me to refer to your race? If we have to talk about sex or gender, what pronouns would you like me to use? We, we stick to those universals, those givens: death, being a meaning seeking organism in a meaningless universe, relationship versus isolation, responsibility and freedom, emotion, the hustle, the need to make a living. This is a weakness. When it comes to helping people who are part of minority groups, this is a weakness. In particular, the focus on individual responsibility might tend to gaslight people who are minorities in a culture that's dangerous to minorities. Happiness, it turns out, is not a choice. It's not a choice at all. So remember those three traits of liberation psychologies where we started. Number one, looking for the universals. Well, we more or less excel at the search for universal human experiences, seeking to understand minority experiences and non neutrality, the active agitation for change. Well, there's overlap, right? There's overlap. We focus on the givens of existence. Perhaps more than other branches of psychology, we work really hard at our cultural competence on average. I've certainly heard some racist statements and rumors thereof in the sort of executive leadership level. And in principle, we understand evil. We know where evil comes from, and we have some idea that evil must be opposed. But in practice, existential psychology is not an overt force in the world effectively campaigning against racism and misogyny. Our Facebook pages certainly seem to express a lot of disappointment in these times that we live in. But we're not founding a lot of political groups to tackle the big social problems, right? And in the final analysis, there's no such thing as an armchair liberator. So, is existential psychology a liberation psychology? On reflection, I think my answer is no. But it might like to be.